Hey everybody, welcome back to my build of this LDO Voron 0.2 kit. We've got the printer basically looking like a printer now, right? So it's all set up here. I've got you a different camera angle view of it today because we finished the electronics last time, and so today what we're going to do is install all of the software. So we need to set up the Raspberry Pi, install the Klipper firmware on all of the different boards and components, and then we're going to go through some sort of initial test setup procedures just to make sure that we've got all of the motors and sensors and everything hooked up correctly and that everything's working. And after that, then we should be able to go ahead and get started with our first print. So that's what we're going to do today, is the software configuration side of this Voron 0.2. And so let's get started. All right, so just a couple of quick housekeeping things to make sure that you know about that have changed since the last time you saw this printer, so since the last episode. If you remember when we were hooking up the electronics here on the back side of the printer, this right here is the connection for the Z endstop. And the kit came with the Z endstop already pre-wired, but the connector on here was a 2-pin connector, and they wanted us to plug it in right here where I've got it plugged in now, which is a 3-pin connector. And so what I had done when we did the initial setup here is I just used this 2-pin slot up here, thinking that I could potentially change the configuration file later on. I've done some research and I've decided that I would rather plug it in where they suggested in the electronics guide and the LDO electronics wiring guide. And so in order to do that, I had to swap this 2-pin connector that they gave me for a 3-pin connector. There's still just 2 wires. So if I can get this unplugged here, I'll show you. There's still 2 wires here, but I did take off the 2-pin connector. All that requires is just using a pair of fine tweezers or something small to poke the little metal tabs here and pull those pins out, and then I replaced it with a 3-pin connection. The 3rd pin here, if you look at the the schematics for the board, is just a 5-volt power, and obviously our little physical switch doesn't need 5-volt power, so all that was needed to do was to use the other 2 wires and leave that pin empty. So it's the top 2 pins in the configuration and the orientation that I have the board sitting here that I used here on this connector, and then I went ahead and just plugged that in here. So if we're keeping track of things that I've changed from the standard LDO kit or additional things I've had to use, that little 3-pin JST connector there was one that I just pulled from my stash of my own connectors. Other than that, the other thing that I did is I grabbed this 16-pin cable here that came with the kit, and it just plugs into the top here where the Pico umbilical board sticks out of the top of the printer, and then the other end plugs obviously up here to the back of our print head. So that's simple enough, it just snaps in place. There's also a sleeve for this to tidy it up later on, but I've not used that yet because I'm just keeping everything sort of raw and uncovered for the moment until we make sure that everything works. So that was one change that I made, and then the other thing that I've done that's different or that's changed is I grabbed just the little print bed here. This kit actually came with 2. So this one's smooth on one side and textured on the other. And the other print bed that they gave me has a weird texture on it. So maybe we'll try that one later on. But for now, we've just put this one on here. And I know that we're going to need this because we've got to calculate the height of our Z in a little while with a piece of paper. And so we need this on here to be able to do that. And so with those changes in place, we've got the printer ready to go. But we're going to have to start with this little micro SD card, which also came with the kit, and it's a fairly good, it's a SanDisk 32 gig card, and so this I think is fairly good. I'm confident that it's going to work long term, no problems. So we're going to go ahead and install the software for our Raspberry Pi onto there and get that configured first. And just for your information, what I'm looking at here is this LDO wiring guide. So this is the same guide that we've been using. This is the one with all the pictures that we were using for doing all the electronics wiring. And down here at the bottom, there's a software setup section. And so the instructions that we're going to follow are basically here, and there are various things linked from here that you can follow along with as well. It's fairly simple and easy to do as long as you follow the instructions pretty closely. You shouldn't have a problem. So I'm going to put this micro SD card into my computer, and we're going to run the Raspberry Pi Imager software that they have you download from here. And all we need to do, according to the instructions, is under Choose OS, we need to pick Raspberry Pi OS Other, and they want us to pick the light 32-bit version, so I'm going to do that. We just choose our storage device. I have a big 4 terabyte drive plugged into my computer, so this is a good example to like make sure you choose the right one, right? Because you don't want to overwrite some other disk that you might have plugged into your computer. So this is the correct one for me. And then when we hit next, it asks us if we want to customize the OS, and yes, we're going to want to do that. And so I'm going to click Edit Settings here, and in this little pop-up that shows up here, there's a few things that I can do, right? I can set the host name, which will be helpful for us finding this on the network later. So my Voron printers are named Voron unit and then a number. They're actually named after Evangelion Eva units from the anime. And so the big Voron that I've already built a while back because of its color scheme is Voron Unit 6. This one's color scheme makes it Voron Unit 3. And so I'm going to call this Voron unit 3.local, and we'll use that later to find it. You're going to want to set a username and password. So you want to type your password in here. You are going to want to configure your wireless LAN as well. So you type your SSID and your password for your wireless LAN here as well. Then you can optionally choose to set the locale settings. That's not really necessary, but you can do that if you want to based on where you are in the world. And you also want to go over here under services and make sure you've enabled SSH with password authentication. So that'll use whatever username and password you've typed right here to do that. So I'm going to go ahead and fill out these passwords, obviously not on video so that you can't see them. And then we'll go ahead and hit save and go ahead and then write the file, flash onto our SD card, the Raspberry Pi software. All right, and so once that's finished flashing that disk image onto our micro SD card there, it'll let us know that it's finished and we can eject our card. So I'm going to hit continue here. I'm going to eject my card from my computer. And then what we're going to do is on the back side of this, where our Raspberry Pi lives, the slot for this micro SD card is up at the top here, kind of on the back side of the Raspberry Pi. And so I found the easiest way, again, to sort of play with these things is just to take them off of the rail. So this goes right in here. We'll just slide that in place, pop this back onto the rail here if I can get it to hook up correctly. There it goes. And with that in place, we can now power this thing on. So we know this power's on. We did a test when we were playing with the electronics last episode, just to make sure that everything powered on. We didn't have all the wiring connected at that point, but this is powered on and should be ready to go. Now, because I've chosen the configuration of the printer here that has no screen anywhere on the printer itself, all we can do is sort of wait for this to boot. It might take a little while, and then from our console, from our command prompt on my computer, we should be able to SSH into this thing. But again, it might take a few minutes for it to boot up, and there's no real visual indication that it's ready to go. You're going to have to just kind of open up your SSH tool and try to connect maybe a couple of times, and then eventually it should connect once everything gets booted up. So I'm going to wait a few minutes here, and then we're going to go ahead and try to connect to this thing. All right, so we're back here with SSH. Remember, I called mine Voron unit 3.local, so that's where I'm SSHing to. You might get this the first time you try to connect. You might get this authenticity check, and you just want to say yes to that. And then you enter your password that you gave the Raspberry Pi setup, and you should then be good to go. So now we're connected to our device, and that looks good. Everything's running, and Raspberry Pi OS is running on our Pi. So the next thing we're going to want to do, following along with the LDO setup guide here, is this, where we set up Klipper and our web interface. And so they suggest, and I agree with their suggestion, that we use this tool. It is the Klipper Installation and Update Helper. I don't know how to pronounce this acronym. I'm not even going to try. But if you go over to the link that's linked in the guide there and you go to the GitHub page, they have instructions here for how to set that up. They also suggest that we use the 32-bit Raspberry Pi OS Lite version, and so we've already done that. And so they give us a few commands here that we can just copy and paste into our command prompt to grab the dependencies to be able to build this thing, and then to pull down the repository from GitHub and run the app itself. And so I will just go ahead and copy and paste those over here into my command prompt one at a time. A few of these might take a little while because they've got to go grab some, updates and other software. So give this a minute. If it takes a few minutes, that's fine. And then we should be good to go. All right, so with everything installed, now we can run the tool. And what it does is it brings us up just this sort of text-based menu. And you see here it says that Klipper is not installed, Moonraker is not installed, none of the other dependencies or optional things are installed either. So the first thing we want to do is install Klipper. And we've got our menu options over here kind of on the left-hand side. So we can type these numbers. So we do 1 for install. And then the first thing we want to install is Klipper. So that's number 1 here on this menu as well. So we'll go ahead and choose that. It asks us which version of Python we want to use, and they recommend a 3-point-something version of Python, which is fine. That's the default, so I'll go ahead and take that. And the number of Klipper instances we want to set up, since we're only controlling one printer here, we only want one instance, so 1 is the correct default there as well. And now, again, we're going to be waiting a little while this downloads and installs all of the dependencies first to be able to build Klipper, and then it will go ahead and build Klipper and get it set up on our Pi here. All right, so for me, that whole process there took about 5 minutes. I've skipped you through a bunch of the video so that you didn't have to sit there and watch all of that. But now we're back to us asking if it wants us to add our user into the group so that we can, have the correct permissions to do what we need to do. So we want to say yes to this, and then it will go ahead and finish up and send us back to the menu. So now that we've installed Klipper, we need to install Moonraker. So that's option number 2 here. This is the same kind of a thing. It's going to ask us, are you sure you want to install it? And we say yes. And then it's going to grab some dependencies and build everything and get it installed. So this one doesn't take as long as the initial Klipper install does. So it should be quite a bit quicker. But again, we'll just wait through this. All right, and then we have a choice to make. We need to install one of the 2 web interfaces. So we can either install Mainsail or Fluid. So those are 3 and 4 here on the menu. I prefer Mainsail just because I've used it more. And so that's the one I'm going to choose. Both of them are very good and basically provide the same functionality. It's just a matter of which interface you're more used to. And so for me, I'm choosing Mainsail. And again, once I've chosen that, it's going to go through the whole install process for that, grab all the packages it needs and build them. And so we'll be waiting again. And once it finishes installing those, it asks us if we want to install some default macros that it puts into our configuration to help us out with a few things related to the Mainsail UI, and I recommend that we do that. So we'll say yes there. And now we're back to the menu again, and we don't need any of this other stuff. Since we don't have a screen on our printer, we don't need Klipper screen, and some of those other optional things we're not going to need either. And so I'm just going to hit B for back here, and then I'm going to quit. And so at this point, we have everything that we need for Klipper and its web interface installed on our machine. And we can close out this Klipper install guide here and go back to our main LDO software setup guide and move on to whatever's next, which is this setting up the firmware, the Klipper firmware on our SKR Pico and our Pico Bilical boards. So to do that, they recommend that we go to the Voron main documentation site, which gives us the instructions for installing on the SKR Pico. And this is pretty simple to do. So we're just gonna, if you follow along here, you wanna make sure that you're connected from your Pico over to your Pi via USB, and we already are. And you SSH into the Raspberry Pi, which we've already done. And so then I'll bring up my SSH here again for you to see. We just want to grab these commands off of that guide. So we're going to make sure that make is installed, and it probably already is. So we'll do these one line at a time. So apt install make, it's probably going to say that's already installed. Yes. We're going to cd into our Klipper directory, and we're going to do a make menu config. So that brings up our menu here, and they want us to enable these extra low-level configuration options. So navigating in here is just arrow keys, and then I'm hitting the space bar to check that. So I enable that, and then they want to make sure that for our microcontroller architecture, we've chosen Raspberry Pi, right, which is down here. And everything else is fine as far as defaults go. So now we can just hit Q to quit. It asks us if we want to save our configuration, and we say yes, we definitely want to save that. And then once we've done that configuration step, we can go make clean. This is actually probably not needed because we haven't ever done a build in this directory before, but we'll go ahead and do that. It's not going to actually do anything. And then we're going to do make, which will now build our Klipper firmware with those options that we had just chosen. So with the Raspberry Pi option and everything else. So again, this is going to take a minute. It's going to compile all the source code and then build that firmware file. All right, so our build is done, and we can come back over here to our instructions and see what they want us to do next. So we're going to need to copy this clipper.uf2 file that our build created, and we're going to need to copy it onto our SKR Pico first of all, and then we're also going to copy it onto the Pico umbilical board as well. So the way that we're going to do that is I need to turn this around so that we can see our board here on the back. And what they want us to do is to take a jumper, and we're going to put this on these two pins right here, the ones close to the little red power light, which tells it that we're going to be in USB mode where we'll be able to write files to it over USB. And so with that jumper in place, then I'm going to hit the reset button, which is this little white button right here on our board. So go ahead and click that in. And that resets it into the correct mode where it can accept files. And then again, following the guide here, and we want to skip this. We don't have it hooked up to our PC, we have it hooked up to our Raspberry Pi. So we go down here to the Raspberry Pi method of copying it. So we've done that reset already, and it gives us these three commands. So we're going to basically mount that drive over USB. I'll show you my command prompt again here. So we're going to mount that drive over USB. That takes a second to mount, and then we're going to copy our firmware file over to that drive. Then we're going to unmount the drive, and everything should be good. It's that simple. So next what they want us to do is remove the jumper. So we can pull this back off again and reset the board again. So clicking that little reset button one more time. And once we've done that, it's back in its normal operation mode, and we should be able to do this LS of our device's serial by ID and see that we have that device available to us. So let's see if that is working. And we see, yeah, we actually see a second one because I already have the Pico umbilical board in place as well, but you should see one of these. I already have my other board connected via USB, so we're seeing two. But it should start with this Klipper RP2040 and then have some unique ID number in it. And then you can see there's a second one here, which we'll get, what you'll get if you're following along once you've connected your Pico umbilical as well. I just happen to have both of them connected already. So just seeing one of those is what you want to see here so that you're sure that that board has the correct firmware on it and that the Raspberry Pi is seeing it correctly, right? So once we've done that, we are done with this little guide. And then we can come back over here and do the same thing for the Pico umbilical. And again, they have a link to here where they show us how to do that. And it's basically the same process, right? I will see if I can show you here on the Pico umbilical board. That one's going to be a little harder to see because it's like up here underneath. But there is no jumper to put in place on this one. There are just two little buttons right here where my finger is, these two little white buttons. One of them is the boot button and one of them is the reset button. And so what you want to do is press them both down and then release the reset one, which is the one toward that side first, and then release this one second. And that puts that device or that board in the same mode again where it's using its USB connection as a file transfer mechanism. And so then once we've done that, we can go back into our command prompt here, and we can actually do the same three commands that we did before. So if we just go back up and we mount that device, and then we do our copy of our same Klipper firmware, and then we unmount it, Once we've done that, then we can go here and hit the reset button one more time. And then everything is back in its normal mode of operation. And so then you can come here, and if you do that LS serial by ID thing, you'll see, if you type it correctly, you'll see the 2 USB IDs there. Now it is important to know which one is which one is your Pico and which one is your umbilical board. And so the easy way to do that is if you just go in here and like unplug your USB cable to whichever one is more accessible. So we could unplug this one or this one, either way. I'll just do this one here. So if we unplug this and then we go back into our command prompt and we do our LS again, you'll see that we only get one of them. And so this ID, this one that starts with 483, is actually our umbilical board, because that's the one that's plugged in right now. And then if we plug this back in carefully, because the board wants to jump off of its mount. There we go. All right, so we plug that back in, and then we do our LS again. Then you see we get both of them again. And so the one that starts with 483 for me is my umbilical board, and this one that starts with 455 is my Pico control board itself. And so it's important to know which one's which, because we're going to need to update our configuration, our Klipper configuration, to have those IDs in them in a little bit. All right, so now with our firmware installed on both of the boards, we can come back here to the main LDO software guide here, and we're to the section for configuring Klipper. So they actually have some pre-made configuration files that we can use, and if we've followed their wiring guide, all the correct pins and everything should already be set up for everything there. So we're going to use that, but first of all, I need to go ahead and open the printer's web interface itself. So we're going to go Voron unit 03.local, which is the name that we gave to that printer. And so this is the mainsail interface, the web interface that we installed. You can see we get a Klipper error, and that's fine because we don't have a configuration in place yet. But if we go here to the machine tab and we can open our printer config, this is where we want to put that basic, or the LDO starting configuration file that they gave us. And so what I'm going to do is just follow the link over on their web, on their guide there to the GitHub page where they have that printer config, and then I'm just going to copy the contents of that and paste it in here, and that'll give us a starting point. All right, so I've copied in the default printer config file that LDO had on their GitHub page. I've just pasted it here over the top of the printer config file that we had. And there are only 3 changes that I needed to make, at least for now. There's some other changes we'll make to this config in the future, because I read through it, I noticed that, for example, they didn't have anything to set up the filament runout sensor that's in the back foot of the printer. There were a few other things missing as well, and a couple of extra things that we don't have, some case LEDs and things like that. So I've left all of that alone for now because it's not going to impact any of the testing that we're going to do. But the 3 things that I did have to change is this include of the mainsail config was commented out. They have a note here that you should uncomment either the fluid one or the mainsail one, depending on which web interface you're using. So I uncommented the one for mainsail because that's what we're using. And then I pasted the 2 USB IDs in here. This one is for our SKR Pico, and this one is for our umbilical board. Those are the ones that we saved off a little while ago when we did that LS serial by ID thing. And so with those 3 changes, I should now be able to hit save and restart. And when I do that, you'll see that everything restarts and our Klipper errors all go away. They should, at least, yes. And everything looks healthy. Now there are like 54 packages that we can upgrade at the system level here. I'm not going to click that and upgrade those now just because I don't want to take the time to do so. I will do that eventually, but that won't affect our testing that we're about to do. We'll jump back here to the dashboard and we'll see that, yeah, things are looking pretty good, right? We have some temperatures being reported for our extruder and our heater bed. So these are our thermistor temperatures here. And yeah, everything else is looking good. So at this point, the next thing to do is go through the official Voron sort of setup and initial checks guide that they have, just to make sure that all of our different motors and sensors and everything are wired up and working correctly. So I'm going to bring that up on my screen here, and then we'll go through that. I'll show you the whole process of working through that guide. Okay, so I've got the Voron official initial startup checks guide loaded here on one half of my screen, and I still have our mainsail UI that's connected to our printer on the other half here. Probably goes without saying, but I'll say it anyway. I don't think I've said it yet in this video. All of these different resources to these guides that I'm using in this episode will be linked down in the description if you're following along. And most of them are linked from that main LDO guide anyway. So what we want to do here is just go through and make sure that everything is working. And so we're going to scroll down here. They give us a little bit of like primer on how the different parts of the interface work. They ask us to verify that we're getting temperature readings from our extruder and our heater bed, and we are, and that they look kind of, you know, like they're within a decent range that would make sense for room temperature, and they do. We also have a chamber thermistor temperature being reported, and I'm not sure, that must be on the tool head board because I didn't install a specific chamber thermistor. I'll have to look through the config, the printer.cfg file and figure out what they think that is, but LDO set us up with one of those as well. So the first step here is to verify the heaters. What they want us to do is to go to each one. So we'll do the extruder one first and just set it to like 50 degrees or so. And I'll show you the printer here as we do this. One thing I noticed, as soon as I set that to 50 degrees, the hot end fan here started spinning, so that's a good sign. And there's probably not much to see there with the printer, but on the web interface here, we should see that our temperature has gone up, and the little graph here went up as well to 50, and then it shut itself down, so it's trying to stay, it actually overshot 50 just slightly, but it's trying to stay right around 50. So that seems good. So we'll go ahead and cool that one back down, and then we'll set the bed heater to 50. So we should be seeing this one cool down, the red line here on our graph, as the blue line then starts to go up. And I also just heard the fan on the hot end just now turn off as well as that hot end starts to cool back down. So this one will take a little bit longer because it takes the bed a little bit longer to heat up, but we'll just wait here. I'll speed you through this as we wait for this to heat up to 50 degrees Celsius. All right, we're almost there. It's reporting, 49. There, just hit 50. It'll probably overshoot again slightly and then come back down. If over here on the printer, if I'm careful not to burn myself, 50 isn't that hot. I should be able to feel, that this is feeling kind of warm. So that's good. The heated bed is working. All right, so again, we'll cool this back down and we'll move on to the next part of our instructions here, which is to check our stepper motors. And so what they want us to do is run this stepper buzz command, and for one motor at a time. And what this does is it moves the motor in one direction and then back the opposite direction just a tiny bit, like 10 or so times in a row. And so we should see things move just very, very slightly back and forth. I'll be looking from the top into the top of the motors here to see the pulleys turning in both spots. So the A motor, or the X one, is this one, and the Y one I think is going to be that one. And it says in the instructions or in the guide there that we want it to turn clockwise first and then counterclockwise. And so I can't get you a good camera angle of that, but I'm going to go ahead and put that stepper buzz command into my console right over here, and we'll show the printer while I do this. So I'm going to go ahead and send that command. And I do see and I feel the motor turning clockwise, then counterclockwise there. And the tool head was moving just ever so slightly. So that worked well for the X. I'm going to do the same thing, except I'm going to change the command to stepper Y. And I can tell that that one's working as well. So that's very good. Then we want to do it one more time and change it to stepper Z. And it says in the guide here that for the Z, it should move the bed up or down and then back up is what we should see here when I go ahead and hit enter on this command right now. And that looks like it's working as well. So very good. And then finally, we can do it also for the extruder. So we can type extruder here in our command. So here we've done X, Y, Z, and now we're doing stepper equals extruder. This one, we're not really going to see any visual indication because I don't have filament in here. I mean, I suppose I could load filament in there. Let's do that. So I'll just put a spare piece of filament in here real quick. Make sure it's down there far enough that it's actually catching on the teeth. Yeah, it definitely is. And so now if I run that extruder stepper buzz, we should see that little piece of filament moving up and down. Yep. So that seems good. It's moving up first and then down second. And I'm not sure if that's the correct direction for the extruder yet, but it says here in the guide that we'll check that later. So there's no way to double check the correct movement direction for that just yet. So I'm scrolling through all of this part of the guide here because there's some troubleshooting here for if things aren't moving in the correct directions, but we're good. And so we can skip through all of that and we can go down here to the end stop check. Now we don't have X and Y end stops, but we do have our Z end stop. And so we can do query end stops over here in our console. And we should see that all of the end stops are open, which is great. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to reach down here with my finger and just push the button. You can't see it because it's down here under the bed, but our Z and stop switch is right down there. So I'm going to just click that down, and then I'm going to go back here and run that query end stops command again with my finger pressing it down, and we can see that the Z says it's triggered. Now I'll release it again, run this again, and we can see that it's open. So the Z end stop is confirmed to be correct. Excellent. Now it wants us to check our X and Y homing. This is maybe a little scary because we're doing sensorless homing on this printer, right? So what's going to happen is the print head is going to move that way for the X-axis homing section of the test, and it's just going to hit the end over here. And assuming that our config that we got from LDO is correct, given the power of the motors and everything that they provided in the kit, we should be fine. Like, it should hit the end, it should detect that, and it should stop and then back up just a little bit. And that's what we want to see. If it hits the end and it keeps grinding, like it keeps trying to run the motor and the belts are skipping and whatever, what we need to do is be ready to hit this little emergency stop button up here at the top of our mainsail UI, because we don't want to damage the printer by having it continue to run. So I'm going to have my mouse cursor over that button and ready to go just in case there's a problem. But the command that we're going to give it, and I think that's all what we're seeing here, is it's warning us about all of that, right? To be ready to do an emergency stop if we needed to. But the command that we're going to do is G28, which is our homing command, and we're going to tell it just in the X-axis for right now. I'm going to switch you back to the view of the printer here before I go ahead and submit that, and I'm ready to hit the emergency stop just in case something goes wrong. So let's do this. And that's exactly what we wanted to see. So it ran over to the end, it detected the end, and then it backed up just a little bit. I'm going to do the same thing again in my console, except I'm going to change the X to Y. So now it's going to home in the Y direction. So it should move back to the back of the printer. Again, hit the back and stop, and then come forward just a tiny bit. That looked good as well. Oh, and it actually, because of the macros that the LDO config gave us, it moved out to the middle once it was done with that, and it set the bed as well. We can also do the G28 with a Z. So we'll do that now as well. That should move the bed all the way down to the switch. And then move it back up a bit. And hopefully it won't crash into the nozzle. Yep, that looks good. All right, so our homing is all good and tested. Very good. Next, they have some motor configuration guides to make sure that your A and B are moving in the correct direction. We know that that's true already because our homing went in the direction that we asked it to, or that we expected it to. So that's good. Next we need to do our bed locating, and this is different depending on which version of a Voron you have. So we've got to scroll down here to the V0 section, right, which is right here. And so what they want us to do, we've already homed the Z. We did that a little while ago. They want us to run Z endstop calibrate. And what that does is it pops up this window if you're running in mainsail. I'm not sure what Fluid does. It's probably something similar. But it gives us this window where we can manually now move the bed up and down, or it's probably better to think of it as moving the nozzle closer or further away from the bed. But you know, in our case with the V0, the bed is the thing that moves, not the gantry itself. So what's going to happen is if I hit minus here, it's going to move the bed up closer to the nozzle. And what we want to do is get a piece of paper. I have this very fancy ripped piece of paper here. And what we want to do is move this such that the paper can fit here between our print surface and our nozzle with just a very little bit of resistance as we try to move the paper around. So it started us like 20 millimeters away from the bed. So let me go ahead and get us close. All right, we'll go about there, and now we're going to start backing it off by smaller increments. So what I'm doing is on this interface here, I'm using the minus 0.1 now instead of the minus 1 to move it closer in smaller increments. And once I start to feel a little bit of resistance on the paper, I will then move it in even smaller increments until I get it just where I want it to be. And then once I've got that set like I want it to be, then you can hit accept here, and it will save that into your configuration. Actually, it will set it into your configuration. It won't actually save it until you type save config here in the console, or there's a save configuration button up here at the top of the screen as well. So I'm just going to do the console version, type save config here, and that will save the config and restart the printer. So you got to wait a second here for that to restart, and then we should be good to go. All right, so now we can go ahead and skip things for other printers that we're not doing, and they want us to PID tune the bed and the hot end. So for that, what this is going to do is it's going to heat the hot end and then the bed up to a temperature that we request. And then it's going to sort of cycle that temperature, I think usually within 5 degrees, up and down, and double check how the thermistor is responding and set a little bit of configuration into your config file to make that process, that heating and cooling process, even more accurate. And so what we need to do is, first of all, because we restarted the printer, I'm going to hit the home all button. I haven't hit this yet on the interface, but I'm going to hit that button, and I'll switch you over here to a view of the printer so you can see what happens when I do that. Right, so what should happen is it should home the Z, which it's doing now, and then it'll home the X and Y and move the bed back up to a good spot. All right, that's good. It's always exciting watching a new printer that you've just finished building actually, start moving correctly for the first time. So, all right, now with everything homed, it wants us to move the nozzle about 5 to 10 millimeters above the bed surface. So I'm just going to change my Z here in our web interface here. It goes to 20 by default. I'm going to change that to 5. And so that just moved the bed up a little bit closer. And then I'm going to go ahead and enter the command that they wanted us to do here for PID tuning the bed. So they're setting it to 100 degrees. It's going to take a little bit of time for it to get up to that temperature. And we can see here the heater turned on and it's starting to go up. But this is going to go up all the way to 100. Then it's going to drop back down to 95, I believe, and then back up to 100. And it's going to cycle back and forth between those two temperatures, I think 5 or 6 times. And so this is going to take a while. It's going to take, I'm not sure on this printer because I've never done it before, but to heat the bed up to that high of a temperature usually takes a little while. So this is a moment where if you're doing this, maybe go get yourself a snack or a coffee or something. but probably stay nearby because you want to make sure, since you're heating up to such a high temperature, that you don't like start a fire or do anything like that. But yeah, this is the point where you can take a little bit of a break while you wait for this to happen, and then when it's finally finished, we'll come back and I'll show you the next part of the process. Okay, we're back. You can see that the bed temp went up to 100 and then down and up and down and up and so on. It gives you some parameters that it calculated that it automatically has put into our configuration file. So again, need to remember to do a save config here to save those, and it will restart Klipper. And then when that comes back up, we can do the same PID tune process for the hot end, right? So this one should be quite a bit faster because that hot end heater, heats up a lot faster. Even though it's going to a higher temperature, it heats up a lot faster. And so we're going to go through that same process. It's going to go up and then down by 5 degrees and back up a few times. And so we'll see that happening here with our red line in our graph. And yeah, just waiting for this to finish. And then once that's finished, it'll ask us to save the config one more time. All right, so while our hot end cools back down, we can do save config again. Our printer restarts, and we can move on to bed leveling, which for the V0, again, it's different depending on which version of a Voron you've built. And this guide is for all of them, right? So it's maybe a little confusing, but just find the V0 section, which tells us how to use a little automated tool here in the mainsail front end to adjust our bed screws. So the idea, right, is that we've got 3 screws, 1 in the front and 2 in the back corners that are holding our bed in place, and we can use those to adjust the tilt of the bed. And over here in our configuration file, if we look at our printer config, somewhere down here, there is actually, they've defined where those bed screws are on the bed. Yeah, so here they are right here. So this came with our LDO config, but this is telling it the coordinates, the X and Y coordinates, where those screws are. And so when we run this bed screws adjust command here, actually before we do that, we're going to have to home all because we restarted our printer, right? So I'm going to hit the home all button and we'll watch this thing do its little homing sequence real quick. All right, that looks good. And now we can do bed screws adjust in our console here. And what that's going to do is it's going to move. Here, I'll show you. It moved the print head to the front of the bed, and where that screw, where it knows, right above where it knows that screw is, right? And then over here in our web UI, it's given us this little dialog that we can interact with. And so what it's telling us it wants us to do is do our paper test right here with our piece of paper underneath and try to get the amount of resistance that we want to have just by in very tiny increments adjusting this screw, right? So if I turn it this way, I'm loosening it, I'm making the bed higher so that the paper is now stuck. If I tighten it, I can get it to where I've got just a little bit of drag on the paper. And so I'm happy with about that amount right there. And so once I've done that, then I can go over here in my UI and I can either say adjusted or accept. So if I adjusted the screw, which I did in this case, I'm going to hit adjusted. And then it's moving over here to the next location, the back corner. And I do the same thing here. That one actually needs to move up a little bit, so I'm going to loosen the screw just a touch. All right, I'm happy with that. So I come back here again and I say that I've adjusted it. Then it moves me over to the back corner. And that one's actually too tight, so I need to screw this down a bit just to loosen that up. And it was just the very tiniest amount of a turn that I needed to do there. All right, so that one's good now. So I go back here and I tell it that I adjusted that one. Now what it's going to do is go back around again. So now it's moving me back to the front to double check, right? And that is good. I'm happy with that amount of drag that I'm getting on the paper. So this time, instead of hitting adjusted, I hit accept because I'm happy with that one. Then it does the same thing again, back to here. And that one actually needs to be a little higher still. Yep, that looks good. So I'm going to hit adjusted there. And I think this actually makes you keep repeating this until you accept all three. Yeah, that one's good. So I'm going to hit accept on that one. It's moving me back to the front again one more time. That one's good. I hit accept. That one's good. I hit accept. All right, so it's happy because I accepted 3 in a row, I guess. And so now we're here and it says the bed screws tool is completed. Now there's nothing for us to change or to save config here because all we did was make physical changes to those adjustment screws on the printer itself. So there we go, and our bed should be roughly level at this point. So we can skip all of the bed leveling stuff for other printers, although it did say up here on the V01 that we should do our Z endstop calibrate again once we've finished that bed adjust, just to make sure that we didn't mess anything up there. And so I'm going to go ahead and hit Z endstop calibrate here. You know what? I'm going to abort out of that. I'm going to move the print head to the middle. I'm just going to actually rehome everything. And then we'll run our Z endstop calibrate one more time. That's pretty good there. All right, so I'm going to accept that. And then one last time in our printer config here, I'm going to save config. All right, so while that restarts, let's go ahead and see what is next. And it is just calibrating the extruder, so the E-steps on our extruder. So before we print the first time, we need to make sure we're extruding the correct amount of filament so that when we ask it to extrude a certain number of millimeters of filament, that is correct, that is what's being pulled through. And in this step, we're also checking to make sure that the extruder motor is running in the correct direction so that when we tell it to extrude, it's pulling filament in, and when we tell it to retract, it's pushing it back out. Okay, so with the printer ready to go, we can go ahead and heat our hot end. I'm going to heat it to, I don't know, about 245. This is a piece of ABS filament that I have in there, and so that temperature should work okay for the ABS filament that I've got loaded in there. And while we wait for that to heat up, we'll just look at the instructions over here to make sure that we know what we're doing. First, it wants us just to make sure that the extruder is running in the correct direction, as I talked about a minute ago. So we're just going to ask it to extrude a little bit of filament, and we can do that over here in the user interface right here. It's already set to 25, so we can tell it to extrude 25 as soon as it gets up to temperature. We'll wait for it to get all the way to the 245 that we requested. All right, so that's looking pretty good. I'm going to hit this extrude button, but I'm going to get you a view of the printer before I do that so that we can all watch what happens. This is the first time I'm ever extruding any plastic at all through this printer. Here we go. All right, I can feel that it's pushing the filament back up. So we do have the extruder motor running in the opposite direction from how it should be. All right, so since our extruder motor was running in the wrong direction, it was retracting when we asked it to extrude, we need to go in here to our printer config and scroll down to the section that talks about the extruder, and this direction pin here, we just put an exclamation mark in front of it to switch its direction. So this makes it run in the opposite direction, and then we can hit save and restart. And once our printer restarts and Klipper gets going again, we can come back over here to the dashboard, and we'll need to reheat our extruder. So we'll go back to 245. It didn't cool down that much, so it probably is actually ready to go already. And then again down here, I'm going to ask it to extrude 25 millimeters of filament, and we will check this. I've got my fingers on the filament here so we can kind of see which direction it moves. So now hitting the button, yeah, it's definitely moving down into the extruder, which is great. So now that our extruder is running in the correct direction, we need to make sure that it's extruding the correct amount of filament. And the way I like to do that is actually using this very fancy metal ruler that actually comes with the LDO Voron kits. I have two of these now because I had one with my other Voron kit as well, and then a piece of masking tape, right? So what we're going to do is we're going to put a piece of masking tape at the 120 millimeter mark on this ruler, so 12 centimeters, and I'm going to try to get that as precise as I can right up on that line, just like so. And then we can put this, just butt this up right against the top of our print head. Make sure that we've pulled the filament nice and straight, and then just transfer that piece of tape from the ruler onto the piece of filament, just like so. All right, so now we know this isn't actually exactly 12 centimeters up, right? Because our tick marks on our ruler start like not right at the edge, but it's fine because we're doing a relative measurement anyway. And so we've got that at about 120 millimeters up. I just realized that was probably out of the frame when I transferred the masking tape onto the filament, but there it is. All right, so now at this point, what they want us to do is to go into our interface here and ask it to extrude 50 millimeters 2 times. So I'm going to click on the 50 here, and I'm going to say extrude 1 time. And we can watch here as this pulls through. We might actually get some filament coming out of the nozzle for the first time as well. Yep, I see some filament coming out of the nozzle. All right, so that stopped. I'm going to hit extrude 1 more time, so we're going to do another 50. All right, and that is finished as well. And so now we can take this ruler and again put it up against the print head here, so that in the same place that we had it before, and we can transfer this piece of tape from the filament back to the ruler. And so now we know 120 minus whatever we've measured here is the amount of filament that was actually extruded. And so going back to our little guide here, they talk about the math here. So what you want to do is you want to subtract where we ended up, which I'm looking at the ruler right now. We actually ended up at 19. Yeah, so 19. So 120 minus 19. So we actually extruded 101 millimeters of filament instead of the exact 100 that we wanted. And so what we want to do is go over here back again to our configuration, our printer config. Go down to our extruder section again, and you'll see this rotation distance parameter right here. And there's a guide, or there's a comment over here that we're supposed to calibrate it. So what we need to do is using this very simple formula here. So our old config value is 22.23, and then we do our 101 divided by what we asked for, which is 100. And if we do that, using my calculator doing that, I got 22.4523. And so we can change this value here to 22.4523. Now at this point, we can save and restart. And then we could run that again. I think they say in the guide to keep running it until you get a consistent value. Like you want it to extrude exactly 100. When you ask for 100. So I'm not going to run through that again here just to keep the video a little bit shorter, but what you want to do is keep repeating that process and keep running the formula again each time against the new value that you put in each time until you get a consistent 100 millimeters of extrusion when you ask for that. And at that point, we're now done with this particular guide. So we're now ready to set up our slicer, which we'll do in the next episode, and then print the first thing here on this printer. So, but just to prove, there's a little blob of extruded filament down here, right? So this is the first thing, I guess, that we've officially printed with this printer. But next time we will set up Orca Slicer, which is my favorite slicer. I'll show you how I set that up for a new printer. And then we'll print some test prints here on the printer and see how it's looking so far. I will see you in that one. Have a good day. See you later.